All right, we're recording. Let's do some attendance. David, Hodges, Eric, Midkiff is here. Rice is here. Cedric, Richardson. Gotcha. Massey's here. Newton, Burdett, Hudson, Felder, Tudor is here. Asbury. Here. Okay, gotcha. Asbury's here. Bowers, Hemmings, Reed, Michaela's here. McKenzie's here. Van Cross, right in front of me. And Richardson, right? We already got Richardson, sorry. Hold on. Burdett? All right, so everybody's accounted for. Let's see. It's not quite 8 yet. Some easy reminders. So for the lab, when you do the pre-lab, well, hopefully you've already done it. But I'm going to go in there and grade it today. So you might have time to change an answer if you need to. So, you watch that little video and they talk about the ecological footprint. And what you really need to know, at least to answer the hypotheses questions, is that in America, our footprint is a lot larger than the average, on the world average. You guys understand that part, right? Because we're an affluent nation. We've got a lot of resources, a lot of money, relatively speaking. So therefore, if you think your footprint is smaller than the world average, for example, then it would be much smaller than the U.S. average. Does that make sense? Think about if we're talking about like an actual footprint. We're not, but imagine think of like a nation full of really small people. I think Koreans are stereotypically short, right? So if you think your footprint, literally your foot, is smaller than the average Korean, then surely you would think that it's going to be a lot smaller than the average American. Does that make sense? Because we're larger people. I know that's two completely different things, but in a way it can work. So does anybody have any questions about how that pre-lab works? So make sure you think about those questions. And make sure you do the pre-lab. Again, I'm going to go in there and check them today after class. So you can go in there and make some corrections if you need to. So any questions about that? All right, let me update the attendance. Bowers is here. What else? Any questions? Oh, yeah, independent work. I know some of you still have 0 points for independent work. And obviously, we only have a couple weeks left in school or for the semester. I know it can be overwhelming, and everyone's different, but if I were in your shoes, because I would be also overwhelmed with that, I would not look at the big picture and be like, man, I've got a lot to do. Don't even focus on how much you still have left to do. Just write little tiny papers. Again, everyone's different, but if it were me, that's what I would do. Just think of a biology question, look it up, and answer it. So any questions about that? All right, well, it's 8:01. We will go ahead and start, jump back into chapter 20. No one has any questions? If I can pull it up. There we go. All right. The first word for attendance. So those of you in person, you can send these words for extra credit. And then if you're online, you can send these words for half credit. Anyway, let's see. The next word for attendance will be, let's just do this, ecology, since that's what we're talking a lot about. Ecology. It's the first word for attendance. Anyway, we left off talking about interspecific interactions. The first interspecific interaction we talked about was competition. So that's competition between two different species. And your book talked about, at the end of that discussion, what an ecological niche is, and you need to know that. I like to think of plants, trees, when I think of ecological niches because they're so different. So really, and this is an important concept for the next chapter, but you have to think about, like, when you talk about an ecological niche, especially, like, I think, again, plants are great examples. It's like asking, what do they need? Like, what temperatures can they survive? Can only get this hot, and can only get this cold. What type of soil do they like? How much water do they like? How much sun do they like? How much shade do they like, right? All the different things. That's what an ecological niche is. We gave an example of two competing barnacles and how their niches overlap. but in this case, one of them outcompetes the other. But this is where we actually left off right here on this side. And here's something else you need to know. It's called the competitive exclusion principle. And it states that if two species have an ecological niche that's too similar, they can't exist in the same place. They cannot coexist because they require too much of the same stuff. So again, if we're talking about trees, if they require the same amount of sunlight and the same amount of water and the same type of soil and the same, they like the same temperature range, all that stuff, then they're probably not going to coexist in the same area. But your book gives us an example of these paramecium. There's two different paramecium. And when you look at them, they look very similar, right? Unless you're a biologist and you can say, oh yeah, that's obviously the paramecium aurelia. But they're very similar. So let's talk about what happens when these things coexist or try to coexist. So these scientists did an experiment where they grew them separately. And you can see how this is the population. So you see the population grows for both of them, the red one and the blue one. And it kind of levels out around the same area too, right? And they had basically the same growth rate. It was very similar. But that's when they were separate. But then when they put them in the same culture and they had to compete for the same resources, then one just outcompeted the other. And in this case, the red one happened to outcompete the blue one. Nothing to study here. I'm not going to ask you any questions about these paramecium. It's just a great example of the competitive exclusion principle. And in nature, these things take care of themselves. Because if these were, I don't know, rodents, for example, and they couldn't coexist because one always outcompeted the other, then as one outcompetes the other, whatever predator there is in nature is going to eat that one, right? And then its numbers will go down and the other ones will go up. And then as those numbers increase, then the predators are going to start eating those more, right? So nature has a way of balancing these things out. But yes, that's the competitive exclusion principle. Any questions about that? Okay. Let's talk. Well, that's maybe a good, decent independent work topic. So yes, I gave you an example of the competitive exclusion principle, and the example was these paramecium. So if you want for independent work, look up some other examples of the competitive exclusion principle. Could be as short as one sentence. I looked it up and said, according to this source, a good example is, I don't know, mice and rats, whatever it may be. Or you can go on and write about it, whatever you want. Mutualism. This is the next interspecific interaction we're going to talk about. This one's very simple. I'm sure you've heard this your entire life. Mutualism is a plus, basically, right, as you can see up here, meaning that both species benefit. So it's a relationship. It's an interaction between two different species where they both benefit. It's pretty much that simple. I'll give you some examples, but you don't need to know the examples. What you need to know for the exam is that first main bullet point. Your book also points out that sometimes this mutualism occurs between symbiotic species, and that's one where there's a close physical association. And the example that your book gives of that is a symbiotic root fungus association known as mycorrhizae. So basically, and this is very common, you can look that up for independent work too. There's so many plants out there that just wouldn't exist without their root fungus, basically. Because what happens is that root, the fungus on the root, delivers minerals and nutrients to the plant. And in return, it gets organic material from the plant. So a lot of the plants wouldn't exist without that fungi, and those fungi wouldn't exist without the plants. And that's what we mean by a symbiotic relationship, right? So yes, not only is it just mutualism where they both benefit, but they both rely on it. In this case, when it's symbiotic, they both rely on it. So again, another great independent work topic. We could look up other examples of mutualism in general, or even more specific, more examples of symbiotic relationships. So any questions about mutualism? This is all pretty simple stuff. Now here's another example from your book. Coral. Corals depend on algae. So they have algae that live inside the cells of the coral. And coral, in case you didn't know, that's an animal. It doesn't necessarily look like it to most people, but coral is an animal. But it has, again, plant cells inside of it. The way that works is the sugars the algae produce provide the energy for the coral, right? So the sugar is photosynthesizing, which is just directly giving the glucose to the coral. And the algae in return gains shelter, and the coral's waste products of carbon dioxide and ammonia, right? So the algae needs carbon dioxide to photosynthesize. It needs the ammonia for other things like protein synthesis and stuff like that. And it's a good symbiotic relationship where they're both basically feeding off each other. Anyway, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any specific examples on the exam. I'm not even sure how the question is going to go for the mutualism. I'm not sure if I'm going to ask you for the definition or if I'm going to give you some random example, and then you need to recognize that as mutualism. So again, if it's a plus and both benefits, both species benefit, then it's mutualism. Any questions? If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little video of yet another example, which is clownfish and the sea anemone. If you've watched Finding Nemo, you should be a little bit familiar with that. All right, so if there's no questions about mutualism, let's talk about, question? Okay, let's talk about predation. This was also very easy. It's in the name. You've probably, again, grown up hearing this stuff, hearing it in school, watching it on nature documentaries if you ever watch them. But predation is one of these plus minus categories where obviously one species benefits and the other one's hurt. And specifically, predation is when one species kills and eats another. And the one that does the killing is called the predator. The one that does the kill, or the one that gets killed, is called the prey. And that'll be the next word for attendance. I'll just circle it instead of saying it. Anyway, that's predation. You're already familiar with it. There's an example. There's a lion attacking the zebra. The lion is the predator. The zebra is the prey. That part's easy. Again, you should be very familiar with it. But your book does go on to talk about some adaptations. So there's numerous adaptations for predator avoidance that have evolved in prey populations. I'm going to give you some examples from the book. And keep in mind, whatever examples I don't give you from the book, you can look up for in the printed work. So what are some other examples of adaptations for predator avoidance? This particular, we can't tell in this picture, but zebras. Does anybody know why zebras are striped? Like, how does that help them avoid predators? Because look, it's sticking out like a sore thumb in that picture. What is it?
Isn't it in the heat?
Yeah, because it's all like wavy anyway. That, and when you get a bunch of them together running in a bunch of different directions, it's just like you can't tell which zebra is which. So yeah. Anyway, so in a sense, even though right now that zebra is sticking out like a sore thumb, in a sense, it's basically camouflage. Another example your book gives is speed, right? So they've evolved speed. Antelopes outrunning a predator is the example, one of your book examples. Rabbits fleeing to a shelter is another book example. And that is a great example of natural selection, because think about it, all the slow ones are going to die. So, and again, there's a variation in every